The plate crashed to the floor, the sharp sound slicing through the low murmur of conversation. It didn't matter. No one looked up. No one cared. People barely noticed anything in this place anymore. Just another graveyard shift. Just another overworked waiter dropping something he couldn't afford to replace. The coffee still burned in the pot. The fluorescent lights still buzzed like an old radio stuck between stations, and Ethan could still hear his landlord's voice playing on a loop in his head. Friday, or you're out. He knelt down, hands moving on autopilot as he scooped up the shards of ceramic. His fingertips burned from the heat, but the pain barely registered. It was nothing compared to the pressure clawing at his chest. 2 months behind on rent. No callbacks. No money. No way out. The bell above the diner's door jingled. A late-night drunk? Another trucker looking for cheap coffee? Ethan didn't bother looking up right away. His shift was almost over, and he didn't have the patience for another customer demanding service like they were at a 5-star restaurant instead of a place with ripped vinyl seats and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. But then, the air changed. It was subtle, like the way a room tensed when something important was about to happen. The sound of rain outside seemed quieter, the buzz of the lights somehow less intrusive. Even the customers, lost in their own late-night fog, shifted in their seats without knowing why. Ethan's gaze lifted, half annoyed, half curious, and then he froze. The man who had stepped inside wasn't just another sleepless wanderer. He wasn't some local drunk looking for warmth. His movements were too deliberate, too familiar in a way that made the air feel heavier. He pulled down his hood, shaking off the rain from his jacket, and took a seat at the counter like he had done it 1,000 times before. And that's when Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Tom Hanks, sitting in a rundown, half-empty diner at nearly midnight, looking like he belonged and yet completely out of place all at once. For a moment, Ethan thought maybe his exhaustion was playing tricks on him, but then Carla, who had never cared about anything in her entire life, actually stopped chewing her gum. The old man in the corner, who barely looked up from his coffee most nights, squinted like he was trying to decide if his eyes were deceiving him. Even Gus, the cook who didn't pay attention to anything that wasn't on a plate, peered through the kitchen window for a split second before disappearing back into the steam. But it wasn't just the shock of seeing him here, in this forgotten corner of the city, that made the air feel heavier. It was the way he sat. Ethan had seen celebrities before. That was just part of living in LA. They passed by in black SUVs, walked into high-end restaurants, showed up at coffee shops surrounded by assistants. They weren't people. They were images, distant, untouchable, existing on a plane separate from the rest of the world. But this? Tom Hanks wasn't walking in with a crowd, wasn't meeting someone important, wasn't sitting with a carefully curated presence like they did in interviews. He was alone, and he looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from long hours on set or promotional tours or red carpets. The kind of tired Ethan knew too well, the kind that settled in the bones, the kind that didn't go away even after a full night's sleep. Ethan wiped his hands on his apron and forced himself to move. His heart pounded as he grabbed a menu, even though his feet felt rooted to the floor. He didn't know why. He had served people 1,000 times before, had faked politeness even when he was dead inside, had smiled when all he wanted to do was disappear. But this felt different. As he approached the counter, Tom Hanks glanced up. And for a moment, Ethan swore there was something in his eyes, something deep, something raw, something that shouldn't be there in a man who had everything. "Welcome to Milo's," Ethan said, surprised by how normal his voice sounded. "Kitchen's closing soon, but I can still get you something." Tom Hanks smiled, not the Hollywood smile, not the one America had seen in a dozen movies, but a small, tired curve of the lips. "What's good here?" His voice was warm, familiar, like hearing an old song from childhood. Ethan hesitated. "What's good here?" Nothing. Nothing was good here. The food was cheap, the coffee was burnt, and the only thing holding this place together was Gus's stubborn refusal to let it die. "We've got the best meatloaf in town," he said instead, because that's what Gus always said, even though it wasn't true. Tom chuckled softly. "Then I'll trust Gus. Meatloaf it is. And coffee." Ethan nodded, scribbling down the order before turning toward the kitchen, his mind racing. Tom Hanks. Here. Alone. At midnight. Something about it didn't sit right. Not because a man like him shouldn't be in a place like this, but because he looked like he needed to be here. And Ethan had a feeling that whatever had brought him in tonight was heavier than anything a plate of meatloaf could fix. The order slip landed on the kitchen counter, the ink still wet from Ethan's pen, but Gus didn't move. He just stared at it, then looked past Ethan toward the man sitting at the counter, then back at the slip, as if it was suddenly written in a language he couldn't understand. For a second, it seemed like he might say something, but instead, he grunted, snatched the paper, and turned toward the griddle. Ethan knew that grunt. It was the same one Gus made whenever a customer ordered something he didn't feel like making but would do it anyway. The same one he made when cops came in after a long shift or when a woman brought in her kids at 3 in the morning because she had nowhere else to go. The grunt of reluctant acceptance. Ethan grabbed a coffee mug, poured the steaming liquid into it, and placed it in front of Tom, who wrapped his hands around the cup like he needed the warmth more than the caffeine. His fingers were steady, his expression calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Ethan's stomach twist. Not sadness, not exhaustion, but something quieter. Something Ethan recognized but couldn't name. "You been here before?" Ethan asked, because that was the only explanation that made sense. Maybe, before he was Tom Hanks, before the movies and the awards, maybe he had been just another guy sitting in a diner like this, waiting for something to change. Tom took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down carefully, like he was measuring his words. "No, never been here before." Ethan frowned. Something about the way he said it, the slight pause, the way his fingers lingered on the rim of the cup, made it sound like there was more to that answer than he was letting on. But before Ethan could say anything else, the bell above the door jingled again, this time harder, sharper, like the wind had thrown it open. 2 men walked in. They weren't regulars. Ethan would have remembered them. Something about them made it impossible not to. One was tall and thin, his hoodie pulled low over his face, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. The other was shorter, stockier, his jacket damp from the rain, his eyes scanning the room too quickly, like he was cataloging everything at once. They didn't sit. They didn't order. They just stood near the entrance, silent, waiting. Ethan's pulse picked up, his grip tightening on the edge of the counter. He had worked enough late-night shifts to know the difference between customers and problems. Tom didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge them, didn't seem to react at all. He just picked up his coffee, took another sip, and stared straight ahead like he already knew they were there. The stockier one finally moved, stepping forward just enough to make his presence known. "You got a payphone?" His voice was rough, deliberate, like someone who wasn't used to asking for things. Ethan didn't look at Tom, but he could feel the shift in him, the subtle way his shoulders stiffened, the way his fingers tapped once against the counter before stilling. "Payphone's broken," Ethan said, because it had been for months, because Gus had never bothered to fix it, because no one used payphones anymore. The man didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer, like he had asked just to see what Ethan would say. Then he took another step forward. "Coffee, then?" Ethan swallowed the urge to tell him they were closing soon, that the coffee was bad, that he should take his friend and leave. Instead, he nodded, grabbed another mug, and poured. His hands weren't shaking, but he could feel the tension winding through his chest, the unspoken weight settling in the room. The taller man still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken. He just stood near the door, his hood pulled low, his hands still buried in his pockets. Watching. Ethan slid the coffee toward the man, who took it without a word. And then, finally, Tom spoke. "You following me?" His voice was quiet, steady, almost conversational, like he was asking about the weather. Ethan's breath caught. The man with the coffee didn't react, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the question at all. But the taller one, the one by the door, shifted just slightly. And in that moment, Ethan knew. This wasn't random. This wasn't 2 guys coming in for coffee. This wasn't coincidence. Tom knew them. And they knew him. The diner felt impossibly still, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The shorter man finally looked up, his gaze landing on Tom. "Just getting coffee." Tom nodded, slow, thoughtful, as if he was considering that answer, as if he was trying to decide whether or not he believed it. Then he pushed his coffee cup aside, folded his hands on the counter, and said, "No, you're not." Silence. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he was sure they could all hear it. The taller man took a step forward, just one, but it was enough. Ethan caught the flicker of movement beneath his hoodie, something shifting, something barely concealed, something he didn't want to see. Tom exhaled, not in fear, not in frustration, but in something else. Resignation, maybe, or understanding. "Not here," he said, and there was something final in his voice, something that left no room for argument. The 2 men exchanged a look. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Ethan caught it, caught the unspoken words passing between them, caught the way their bodies tensed like they were deciding something. And then, just as suddenly as they had come in, they turned and walked out. The bell jingled. The door swung shut. The air shifted back to normal. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Tom picked up his coffee again, took another sip, and then looked at Ethan like nothing had happened at all. So, about that meatloaf. And just like that, everything was the same. Except it wasn't. Gus slid the plate onto the counter with a dull thud, the steam rising in soft curls from the thick slice of meatloaf and the mound of mashed potatoes beside it. Ethan grabbed it without a word, but his hands weren't steady, his pulse still hammering against his ribs. He carried the plate over to Tom, placing it in front of him like nothing had happened, like two men hadn't just walked in and left the air in the diner charged with something unspoken. Like Tom hadn't just looked at them with the kind of quiet authority that made them turn around and leave without another word. Tom picked up his fork, cut into the meatloaf with an easy familiarity, lifted a bite to his mouth, and chewed, nodding slightly as if he had expected exactly what he got. "Not bad," he said, like they had been talking about food this whole time, like nothing had shifted, like this was just another late-night stop on a long road. Ethan wanted to ask something, but the words stuck in his throat, his mind cycling through too many questions at once. Who were those men? Why did they leave so easily? What was Tom Hanks doing here, sitting in this diner, alone, at this hour, looking like a man waiting for something he didn't want to arrive? Carla had gone silent behind the counter, her usual apathy gone, her eyes darting between Ethan and Tom, but she didn't say anything. The old man in the corner had finally looked away, deciding that whatever just happened wasn't worth getting involved in. Gus, from behind the kitchen window, had already gone back to his cooking, but Ethan knew he had been watching. Gus saw everything. Ethan grabbed the coffee pot and refilled Tom's cup, his fingers still curled too tight around the handle. He didn't know why, but he needed to say something, needed to break whatever tension still lingered, needed to understand what had just happened. "You don't seem surprised." Tom didn't look up from his plate. "Should I be?" Ethan hesitated, not knowing how to answer that. Tom cut another piece of meatloaf, chewing thoughtfully before setting his fork down. "People walk into places they don't belong all the time," he said, his voice calm, almost casual, but his eyes flicked toward the door like he was still listening, still waiting. "It's what happens after that matters." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry even though he hadn't spoken much. He didn't know what Tom meant, but it didn't sound like something rehearsed, didn't sound like a line from a script. It sounded like something he had learned the hard way. The bell above the door jingled again, and Ethan's muscles tensed before he could stop himself, his breath catching in his chest as he turned. But it wasn't the two men coming back. It was a woman. She was soaked from the rain, her hair clinging to her face, her coat dripping onto the floor. She moved quickly, her eyes darting around the diner like she was looking for someone. But when she saw Tom, she stopped. Ethan knew that kind of stop, the kind where relief and frustration tangled together, the kind where a person had spent too much time looking and finally found what they were afraid to. Tom set his fork down, exhaling slowly as he turned toward her, his expression unreadable. She stepped forward, jaw tight, voice sharp despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "You can't just disappear like that." Tom didn't flinch, didn't move, just studied her for a moment before nodding once, like he understood why she was angry, like he had expected this. "I needed a minute." "A minute." She let out a sharp breath, pushing damp strands of hair away from her face. "Do you have any idea what's happening right now?" Tom reached for his coffee, took a slow sip, and Ethan swore it was the most deliberate movement he had ever seen. When he set the cup down, his voice was even, steady, but there was something beneath it, something heavier. "Yeah, I do." The woman's hands curled into fists at her sides, her frustration clear. But there was something else in her expression too, something closer to fear. Ethan wasn't sure he should be hearing this, but neither of them seemed to care that they weren't alone. She took another step forward, lowering her voice. "They're looking for you." Tom nodded, as if that, too, was something he already knew. Ethan felt like the entire diner had shrunk, like the walls had pressed in just a little, like he had suddenly stepped into the middle of something much bigger than himself. The woman looked at Tom like she was waiting for him to say something, to explain, to do anything other than just sit there like none of this mattered. But Tom only reached for his fork again, cutting another piece of meatloaf, the moment stretching unbearably before he finally spoke. "They won't find me here." The woman let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "That's not how this works." Tom's eyes lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted, something that made Ethan's stomach tighten. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something closer to resolve. "You should go," Tom said, his voice softer now, not unkind, but firm in a way that didn't leave room for argument. The woman opened her mouth like she was going to fight, like she had a dozen things she wanted to say, but in the end, she just shook her head, stepping back. "You always do this," she muttered under her breath, turning toward the door. She paused just before stepping outside, looking back one last time, her expression unreadable. Then she was gone, the bell jingling as the door swung shut behind her, the cold air rushing in before settling again. Ethan felt like he had forgotten how to breathe. Tom picked up his coffee, took another sip, and when he spoke again, it was like the conversation had never happened. "You ever think about leaving?" Ethan blinked, his brain struggling to catch up. "What?" "This place," Tom said, nodding toward the diner, toward the city beyond it, toward whatever life Ethan was barely holding together. "You ever think about walking away from all of it?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it, because he didn't know how to answer that. Tom just nodded, as if he already knew the answer. Then he went back to his meatloaf. Ethan had never been the type to ask questions when it wasn't his place, but everything about this night felt like it was dragging him into something he didn't understand. The two men who had walked in and left without a fight, the woman who showed up soaked in rain, her voice laced with urgency, Tom Hanks sitting in the middle of it all as if nothing unusual was happening, none of it made sense. He should have ignored it, should have gone back to work, should have let the moment pass like every other strange thing that had happened in this city, but the way Tom had asked that last question, like he had already decided Ethan's answer for him, made something in his chest tighten. Ethan grabbed the coffee pot again, even though Tom's cup was still nearly full, because he needed something to do with his hands. His voice was quieter when he spoke this time, as if lowering it would make the question less dangerous. "Who were they?" Tom didn't look up immediately. He finished chewing, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and exhaled through his nose like he had been expecting the question but had hoped Ethan wouldn't ask. He tapped his fingers once against the counter, a quiet rhythm against the faded surface, before finally lifting his gaze. "Just some guys who don't know when to let things go." Ethan didn't believe that for a second. The tension in the woman's voice, the way the two men had moved, the way Tom had spoken to them like he was giving them a choice they didn't want to take, it wasn't something that happened over a simple misunderstanding. He could feel it in his gut. Tom must have noticed the way Ethan's grip tightened on the coffee pot handle, because he sighed and leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to get involved in this." Ethan let out a short laugh, though it held no humor. "I think it's a little late for that." Tom tilted his head slightly, as if considering that, then gave the smallest of nods. "Maybe." He took another sip of coffee, then set the cup down with deliberate care, his eyes scanning the room as if checking for something Ethan couldn't see. He stayed silent long enough that Ethan thought maybe he wasn't going to answer at all, but then, finally, he spoke. "There's a reason I'm here and not somewhere else." His voice was measured, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something carefully held back. "Some people think I owe them something. I don't." He paused, rolling his shoulders slightly before continuing. "But they don't like that answer." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't stupid. This wasn't some fan encounter gone wrong or a business dispute that got a little messy. This was something bigger, something personal, something that had made Tom Hanks, of all people, leave wherever he had been and show up in a half-dead diner at nearly midnight, sitting in the middle of a rainstorm like he was waiting for something inevitable. Ethan swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. "Are they coming back?" Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his fork again, cutting another piece of meatloaf, eating it like the question didn't matter, like he was used to things like this, like the idea of someone walking through that door looking for him again wasn't something worth worrying about. But then, he set the fork down, wiped his mouth again, and met Ethan's eyes with a look that made it impossible to breathe. "Yes." Ethan's grip tightened around the coffee pot, his heart hammering harder than it should have. He didn't know why, didn't know if it was fear or something else, but the certainty in Tom's voice, the way he said it like it was a fact and not a possibility, sent a chill through his spine. The diner had always felt like a place where time didn't move, where nothing changed, where people came and went and left nothing behind. But now, standing here, looking at the man sitting across from him, Ethan felt like the walls were closing in, like something was shifting beneath his feet, like the air was thicker than it had been when he started to shift. Carla, who had been silent for too long, finally cleared her throat. "Look, I don't know what's going on, and I don't want to know, but if this is going to turn into something, I'd rather not be standing in the middle of it." Tom turned his head slightly, as if just now remembering she was there, then nodded once. "That's fair." Carla let out a sharp breath, tossing her rag onto the counter before running a hand through her hair. "I'm taking my break." She didn't wait for a response before walking toward the back, disappearing through the swinging door that led to the storage room. Ethan watched her go, feeling the weight of the silence that followed. He could hear the rain hitting the windows, the distant sound of a car passing on the street, the faint hum of the flickering neon sign outside. Everything felt too quiet, too still, like the city itself was holding its breath. Tom reached for his coffee again, taking a slow sip before setting it down. You ever been in a situation where you know what's coming, but there's nothing you can do to stop it? Ethan hesitated, not sure if the question was rhetorical. Tom didn't seem to need an answer. He just exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly, a tired smile ghosting across his lips. It's a strange feeling. Ethan didn't know why, but the way he said it made his chest tighten. He didn't know what was coming, didn't know what Tom had done or who those people were or why he had chosen this place to sit and wait, but the certainty in his voice, the calm acceptance, made it clear that whatever it wasn't over. The bell above the door jingled again. Ethan's breath caught. And this time, Tom didn't even bother turning around. Ethan didn't want to turn around. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stay still, to pretend he hadn't heard the bell, to let this be someone else's problem. But the air in the diner had changed again, heavier than before, like the walls were bracing for something neither he nor anyone else was ready for. He set the coffee pot down, his fingers gripping the counter as if it could anchor him in place. But he forced himself to turn, to look, to see what had just walked in. It wasn't the two men from earlier. It wasn't the woman who had been desperate to get Tom to leave. It wasn't anyone Ethan recognized, and somehow that made it worse. There were three of them. The first was a man in his 40s, broad shoulders, dark coat, clean-shaven but rough around the edges in a way that said he wasn't someone you wanted to cross. His eyes scanned the diner with quick efficiency, taking in every detail, every exit, every person. The second was younger, maybe early 30s, his hair buzzed close to his scalp, his posture stiff like he was waiting for an order. The third was older, late 50s, maybe even 60, dressed in a simple button-down, his face calm, unreadable. He walked with the confidence of someone who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The older man stepped forward, his shoes barely making a sound against the tile floor. His eyes flicked to Ethan, then to Gus, who had stopped pretending to work and was now standing behind the kitchen window, his hands pressed flat against the counter. Then, finally, the man's gaze settled on Tom. Tom didn't move, didn't react, didn't even pretend to be surprised. He just exhaled slowly, like he had been expecting this exact moment. He reached for his coffee again, took a sip, and set the cup down before speaking, his voice even. Figured it'd be you. The older man smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. You always did have good instincts. Ethan didn't know what was happening, didn't know why every word felt like it carried weight, like this wasn't just a conversation but something else, something bigger. His pulse pounded in his ears, and he could see Carla through the small window in the kitchen door, peering out, her face pale, waiting to see if she needed to run. Tom didn't seem afraid. He didn't straighten up, didn't tense, didn't do anything except glance at the plate of half-eaten meat loaf in front of him before lifting his gaze again. You could have just called. The older man chuckled softly, shaking his head. Would you have answered? Tom didn't respond, and that was answer enough. The younger man with the buzz cut took a step forward, his hands shifting slightly at his sides, like he was waiting for a signal. The older man noticed, lifting a hand just enough to make him stop. Relax, he said, still watching Tom. We're just talking. Ethan didn't believe that for a second. Tom reached into his jacket pocket, slow, deliberate, and for a brief second, Ethan thought he was reaching for something dangerous, but when his hand emerged, all he was holding was a crumpled $20 bill. He smoothed it out against the counter and placed it next to his plate. Dinner was good, he said, nodding slightly toward Ethan. Tell Gus I'll have to come back for the pie next time. Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe. The older man's expression didn't change. Let's go. Tom finally pushed his chair back, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He stood, adjusting his jacket, his movements slow, unbothered. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't resisting. He was choosing to go. And somehow, that made it worse. Ethan's mouth was dry, his throat tight. But before he could stop himself, he spoke. Wait. Everyone turned. The air in the diner felt suffocating, but Ethan couldn't stay silent, couldn't just watch this happen without knowing. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to meet Tom's eyes. What's going on? Tom studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then, for the first time that night, he smiled, not forced, not polite, not empty. A real smile. You're a good kid, he said simply, as if that was all the explanation Ethan needed. Then he turned, walking toward the door without hesitation. The older man followed, the younger man trailing just behind, the broad-shouldered one watching Ethan for a beat longer than necessary before stepping outside. The door closed. The rain had stopped. Ethan stood frozen, his fingers still curled against the counter. Gus hadn't moved. Carla hadn't stepped out. The old man in the corner had finally looked up, staring at the door like he had just witnessed something impossible. The diner was silent. And then, without thinking, Ethan reached forward and grabbed the crumpled $20 bill Tom had left behind. He turned it over. There was something written on the back, hastily scribbled in blue ink. 2 words. Walk away. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. He didn't know what Tom had meant, but somehow, deep down, he knew. Ethan stared at the $20 bill for too long, the inked words, walk away, pressing into his mind as if they had been branded there. The bell above the door had stopped jingling, the rain outside had died down, and the silence in the diner had settled into something thick, something heavy. Gus hadn't moved from behind the kitchen window, Carla hadn't come back from the storage room, and the old man in the corner was still looking at the door like he expected it to swing open again. But it wouldn't. Tom was gone, the men who had come for him had left, and the night was slipping back into whatever passed for normal in a place like this. Ethan placed the bill on the counter, smoothing it out even though his fingers still trembled slightly. He wanted to believe it didn't mean anything, that it was just some vague piece of advice, something people said when they thought they were wiser than they were. But the way Tom had looked at him before he left, the weight behind his words, made it impossible to ignore. Walk away from what? The diner? The city? The life he was barely holding together? Ethan had spent so long scraping by that he wasn't sure what it would even mean to leave, wasn't sure if he even had a choice. But something about tonight had shifted something in him, something he couldn't explain but couldn't push aside. Gus finally moved, stepping out from the kitchen like he had just made up his mind about something. He grabbed a towel, wiped his hands, and glanced at the door before looking at Ethan. You okay? Ethan swallowed, nodding even though he wasn't sure if it was true. Yeah. Gus didn't believe him. Neither did Ethan. The old man in the corner finished his coffee and stood, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket and setting them on the table. He looked at Ethan as he adjusted his coat, his voice low and rough from years of cigarettes and bad coffee. Don't think too hard about it, kid. Ain't our business. Ethan didn't respond, watching as the man shuffled toward the door, pushing it open and disappearing into the wet streets outside. Maybe he was right. Maybe this wasn't his business. Maybe it never had been. Maybe he should just shake it off and finish his shift, pretend none of it had happened. But that didn't feel possible. Not anymore. Carla finally reappeared, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable as she leaned against the counter. So, are we going to talk about the fact that Tom Hanks just got picked up by some guys who looked like they were deciding whether or not to shoot him? Gus shot her a look, but Carla didn't care. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know what just happened. Carla scoffed. No kidding. She grabbed a dirty cup from the counter, tossing it into the sink with more force than necessary. This city's a black hole. People come here thinking they're going to be something, and then one day they wake up realizing they're just stuck. And sometimes, when they figure it out too late, they get desperate. Whatever he was running from, whoever those guys were, it's the same thing as all the rest of us. Just bigger. Ethan didn't know why, but her words made his stomach twist. Gus didn't say anything, just grabbed the rag from his shoulder and started wiping down the counter, as if nothing had happened, as if Tom had just been another customer, as if the whole night had been ordinary. But Ethan knew better. He could feel it, deep in his chest, in the way his pulse still hadn't settled, in the way the air in the diner still felt different. He glanced at the $20 bill again, at the messy handwriting, at the 2 words that wouldn't stop repeating in his head. Walk away. Ethan's shift ended at 2, just like it always did. But when he stepped out into the damp night air, the streets didn't feel the same. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still wet, the streetlights casting dull reflections that shimmered as he walked. The city was never really quiet, but tonight it felt different, like something had shifted, like the streets weren't the same ones he had walked 100 times before. He should have gone home. He should have climbed the stairs to his too small apartment, should have collapsed onto his mattress, should have woken up in a few hours and done it all over again. But instead, he just stood on the sidewalk, looking in the direction Tom had gone, knowing he would never see him again, knowing that whatever had just happened was bigger than he could ever understand. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he pulled it out, the message on the screen made his chest tighten. Friday. Or you're out. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, then looked at the $20 bill still crumpled in his fist. Then he started walking. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a long time, he knew it wasn't back.